There is a specific dynamic that runs underneath avoidant relationships that almost never gets named directly. The avoidant operates at some functional level with the assumption that their management strategies are working, that the careful calibration of emotional distance is not visible as calibration, that the withdrawals read as simply needing space rather than as the fear-driven pattern they actually are, that the managed warmth passes as genuine availability rather than as the specific, controlled quantity of closeness that the defensive architecture is rationing, that the person on the other side of all this management is experiencing the surface presentation rather than the reality underneath it. They thought you did not know what was happening. They thought the composed exterior was what you were encountering. They thought the managed version of themselves was the version you were relating to. They thought, in a specific and often unconscious way that people think things they have never examined directly, that the performance was working, that the distance was being received as preference rather than as defense, that the pattern was invisible to you as a pattern. You knew. You knew from earlier than you have perhaps fully acknowledged to yourself. You knew in the specific, embodied, below-conscious way of someone whose perception was accurately reading a situation that the situation was working to make illegible. You knew in the honest hours and in the quiet moments of clear seeing that kept arriving despite the dynamic's consistent effort to produce uncertainty instead of clarity. You knew what the withdrawals were. You knew what the managed warmth was. You knew the difference between the real person and the presented version. You knew the pattern as a pattern long before the pattern ran its full course. What you did with the knowing is a separate question. The knowing and the acting on the knowing are different things, and the distance between them is where much of the cost of avoidant dynamics lives. But the knowing itself was always present. Always accurate, always the most honest available read of what was actually happening between two people in a dynamic that one of them was working to keep from being clearly seen. This conversation is about that knowing, about what it consisted of, about how accurate it actually was, and about what it means that the knowing was present throughout, for the avoidant, for you, and for the honest understanding of the full situation. The first thing the knowing consisted of was the accurate perception of the gap between the presented version and the real version, the specific, reliable, practically continuous awareness of the difference between what the avoidant was showing and what they were actually experiencing, between the composed exterior and the activated interior, between the self-sufficient presentation and the genuine attachment running underneath it. This perception is not something you learn from reading about avoidant attachment psychology. It is something you develop through the direct, experiential, sustained attention of someone who is paying very close attention to a specific person over an extended period of time. The gap between the presented and the real is not visible from a distance or from a brief acquaintance. It is visible through the accumulation of small, specific, individually deniable but collectively undeniable observations made by someone who is genuinely present and genuinely attentive. The slight change in quality when the warmth was genuine versus when it was managed. The specific texture of the contact that came from real engagement versus the texture of contact that was coming from the defensive architecture's version of engagement. The micro differences in the quality of presence, the being fully there versus the being partially there and partially somewhere else, that characterize the managed version, the specific involuntary signals that the genuinely felt moments produced versus the signals that the calibrated moments produced. You noticed all of this, not always consciously, not always with the specific language that makes the noticing articulable, but you noticed. The body noticed before the mind had the words for it. The felt sense of something is different here arrived, consistently and reliably, even when the surface behavior was presenting the managed version as the complete picture. This perception was accurate. It was not the overreading of someone who was anxious about the relationship and therefore seeing problems where none existed. It was not the distortion of someone who wanted more than was available and was projecting that wanting onto a situation that did not warrant it. It was the accurate, embodied, repeatedly confirmed read of someone whose attention was genuinely calibrated to the specific person they were with. The second thing the knowing consisted of was the accurate understanding of what the withdrawals were, not what they were presented as, what they actually were. The withdrawals were presented, in the various forms that avoidant withdrawals take, as reasonable responses to reasonable things, as needing space, as being busy, as the ordinary non-relational fluctuations of a person who has their own life and their own interior demands that sometimes require attention away from the connection, as the natural non-problematic variability of any relationship's texture. You knew there was something else. You knew, with the specific, quiet, persistently present knowing of someone who had observed the pattern enough times in enough contexts to understand its structure, that the withdrawals were not randomly distributed across the circumstances of ordinary life. They clustered at specific moments, the moments of genuine closeness, the conversations that reached the level of real depth, the interactions where something true and mutual passed between two people, and the quality of the connection deepened into something that could be felt as genuinely significant. Those moments were reliably followed by the withdrawal, not always immediately, sometimes the next day, sometimes the next week, but with enough consistency to constitute a pattern rather than a coincidence. The deepening produced the retreat. The closeness activated the distance. The moments that felt most real were most reliably followed by the managed withdrawal back to the comfortable level. You tracked this, maybe not on paper, not in the explicit, documented form of someone running an analysis. In the quiet, experiential, gradually accumulating way of someone whose internal pattern recognition was processing the data of lived experience and arriving at conclusions that the conscious mind was sometimes not yet ready to fully acknowledge. The knowing was there. The pattern was visible. The structure of the withdrawals as a response to the approach of genuine intimacy rather than as the neutral circumstantial fluctuations they were presented as. That was something you understood, with or without the language of avoidant attachment psychology to organize it. The third thing the knowing consisted of was the understanding of what was underneath the composed exterior. Not complete knowledge. The defended interior is, by design, not fully accessible from outside it, but substantial, accurate, honest understanding of what the management strategies were managing against. You understood the fear, not necessarily as fear. The avoidance experience of the fear rarely presents itself as fear in the legible, clearly labeled form of an emotion that can be named and addressed. It presents as the specific behavioral responses that fear produces. The pulling back, the cooling, the sudden availability of reasons for distance at moments when closeness had been building. The specific quality of someone who is simultaneously genuinely drawn toward and genuinely frightened by the same thing. You understood this duality, the genuine wanting and the genuine fear running simultaneously. The warmth in the unguarded moments and the management of the warmth back to a comfortable level in the moments when the genuine engagement would have required genuine vulnerability. The specific, observable, accurately perceived quality of a person who wants the connection and cannot fully inhabit it, because inhabiting it fully would require the lowering of defenses that have been maintained at significant cost for significant time. You understood that this was not about you, that the fear was not a response to your specific qualities or your specific way of showing up in the relationship, that it was older than you, deeper than you, organized around experiences and early learning that predated your involvement entirely, that the withdrawals were not evidence of your inadequacy, but of their fear, that the managed distance was not a verdict on your worth, but a defense mechanism running its predictable program. This understanding is one of the more costly things the knowing produced, because it made it harder to leave. Because understanding that the pattern was fear-driven rather than indifference-driven is the understanding that compassionate people use to stay in things longer than is healthy. The understanding was accurate, and it was also the specific costly kind of accurate that kept the generosity going past the point where the situation was adequately honoring it. The fourth thing the knowing consisted of was the recognition of the genuine feeling underneath the pattern. The specific, honest, perception-based understanding that the genuine feeling was real and was present despite everything the pattern was doing to keep it at a manageable level. You knew the feeling was there, in the unguarded moments, in the specific quality of attention you received when the defensive architecture was briefly not running at full capacity, in the involuntary signals that genuine feeling produces in ways the conscious management cannot fully intercept. You knew that what was between you was not one-sided, that the genuine resonance, the specific quality of recognition that passed between two people who genuinely saw each other, was not something you were projecting onto a situation that did not contain it. This knowing was simultaneously the most sustaining and the most costly thing about the whole experience. Sustaining because it was accurate, the feeling was real, and knowing it was real provided the specific, honest basis for continuing to invest in something that had genuine depth beneath the insufficient surface. Costly because genuine feeling, unaccompanied by the willingness and capacity to express and act on it adequately, is not sufficient to build a functional relationship on. The genuine feeling and the functional relationship are different things. The knowing that the feeling was real kept you in the dynamic past the point where the functional relationship was demonstrating its limitations clearly enough to require a different response. The fifth thing the knowing consisted of was the understanding of the specific dynamic of what your presence was providing and what the pattern was taking for granted. You knew at some level that the clarity of distance has since made more explicit, that you were doing more of the work than was being done in return, not as a conscious calculation of relational labor, not in the deliberate ledger-keeping way of someone tracking contributions and withdrawals. In the felt, embodied, below-conscious way of someone whose interior was registering the imbalance without the conscious mind necessarily translating the registration into explicit language. You knew that your consistency was being relied on without being adequately acknowledged, that the pattern of your reaching after their withdrawals was being received as the expected next event, rather than as the generous, costly, chosen act of love it actually was. That the specific, reliable, always there quality of your presence was functioning as the background assumption of a person whose self-sufficiency narrative was being sustained by the specific, functional, entirely unacknowledged contribution of your consistent caring. You knew this. Not with the explicit, articulated, ready to present as evidence clarity of someone who had processed the dynamic all the way through. With the quiet, persistent, slightly uncomfortable knowing of someone who could feel the imbalance in the specific daily, lived experience of being the one who reached more consistently, who showed up more reliably, who brought more of the active investment to the daily maintenance of a connection that was presenting as mutual while actually running asymmetrically. The knowing of this imbalance was present, was accurate, was one of the things the management strategies were specifically working to prevent from becoming too loud, because the imbalance being clearly seen was the specific threat to the comfortable configuration that the avoidance patterns most needed to avoid. The sixth thing the knowing consisted of was perhaps the most significant, and the one whose presence is worth acknowledging most directly. You knew how it was going to end, not as a declared prediction, not as a conscious, articulated forecast that you were running in the background of the daily experience. As the specific, quiet, persistently present felt sense of someone who could see the logic of the pattern and understood where the logic was pointing, as the honest knowing of someone whose perception was accurately reading the trajectory and arriving at the honest conclusion about where the trajectory led if the pattern was not genuinely interrupted. The knowing of the ending was present long before the ending arrived. It was there in the specific recurring moments of clear seeing that kept arriving despite the dynamics production of hope and warmth and the intermittent evidence of genuine depth. It was there in the honest hours. It was there in the specific quality of knowing that the good periods produced alongside the genuine pleasure of the good periods, the specific, quietly present, cannot be entirely suppressed awareness that the good period would be followed by the familiar pattern, because the pattern was not changing at the structural level that would have made the good periods lasting rather than intermittent. You knew, and the knowing of the ending, present throughout, is one of the more important pieces of the honest accounting. Not because it means the investment was foolish. Genuine feeling in the context of genuine connection is not made foolish by an ending that was visible in advance, but because it is part of the full picture of what was happening, of what you were carrying, of what the dynamic was asking you to hold alongside the love and the hope and the genuine investment in something real. You were holding the knowing of the ending and continuing to invest anyway. That is not naivety. That is the specific, costly, genuinely generous quality of someone who loves with their whole capacity, rather than with the rationed, self-protective version that keeps the investment calibrated to the perceived likelihood of a good outcome. The avoidant did not know you knew, or they knew partially and managed the knowledge to a comfortable level, allowed themselves to operate with the functional assumption that the management strategies were opaque, that the distance was being received as preference, that the surface presentation was the version you were encountering. The specific irony of this, the avoidant managing their own awareness of your awareness, is worth examining honestly because it illuminates something important about the psychology of the defensive architecture. The defensive architecture is not primarily organized around deceiving others. It is organized around managing the avoidant's own experience of their interior, around keeping the genuine feeling, the genuine need, the genuine fear at a level that is compatible with the self-sufficiency narrative and the composed exterior. The management of your awareness of this was in some sense a secondary effect of the primary project of managing their own awareness. But there was also something more deliberate in the not knowing you knew. something that served the comfortable configuration, because your knowing, genuinely acknowledged as the knowing it was, would have required a different kind of engagement, would have made the pretense of the management strategies as anything other than management strategies impossible to sustain, would have required the honest conversation about what was actually happening that the avoidance defensive architecture was specifically organized to prevent. The comfortable configuration depended on your knowing remaining at the level of felt sense rather than explicit acknowledgement, depended on the perception remaining in the territory of something feels off rather than I see exactly what is happening and I understand its structure. The managed version of the dynamic could survive your implicit knowing. It could not have survived your explicit, clearly articulated, fully acknowledged knowing, meeting the avoidance willingness to genuinely engage with what the knowing was reporting. And so the functional assumption that you were not fully seeing was useful to the comfortable configuration, was maintained because its maintenance was compatible with the continuation of the dynamic in its current form, was part of the larger system of management that kept the genuine engagement at a comfortable distance. What does it mean that you knew? What is the honest, practically useful, forward-facing understanding of what this knowing says about you and about the experience? The first thing it means is that your perception is reliable. This is not a small thing. One of the most specific and most costly effects of avoidant dynamics on the people who inhabit them is the gradual erosion of confidence in their own accurate perception. The dynamic's consistent implicit message that the honest read is too much, that the interpretation is inflated, that the emotional response is disproportionate to the actual situation, deposits a specific doubt. The habit of second-guessing the accurate perception before it can become the basis for action. The knowing throughout, the accurate, persistent, repeatedly confirmed perception of what was actually happening, is the honest answer to that doubt. The perception was right, was working correctly the whole time, was providing accurate information about the real situation in the face of a dynamic that was working to produce uncertainty rather than clarity. That reliable perception is yours, is operative, is available in every subsequent context. The experience did not damage your ability to see clearly. In some ways, it enhanced it, sharpened the calibration, built the specific practical accuracy of someone who has been required to read underneath the surface for extended time and has developed genuine skill at doing so. The second thing the knowing means is that what you did with the knowing is worth honest examination rather than either proud vindication or harsh self-judgment. You held the knowing and continued to invest. That was a choice, made repeatedly, made from a position of genuine love and genuine perception of the real thing underneath the pattern, made with the specific, generous, sometimes costly quality of someone who was choosing the possibility of the real thing over the certainty of the protection. Whether that choice was the right one is not a question with a clean answer. It was the choice of a person with genuine feeling and genuine capacity for sustained investment, making the best available decision with the information and the internal resources available at each specific moment. Some of those moments the choice was clearly worth it. Some of them the choice was already costing more than the situation was returning. The full arc of it produced what it produced: the ending, the understanding, the genuine knowing of your own worth, the specific hard-won clarity that the experience deposited. The third thing the knowing means is that the ending was not a surprise, was not the sudden, unexpected revelation of a situation that had been presenting as something other than what it was the honest, finally acted upon conclusion of someone who had known throughout and had finally arrived at the place where the knowing was loud enough, and the investment of continuing to hold the knowing alongside the hoping and the loving was costly enough. That the action the knowing was always pointing toward became unavoidable. You knew everything, not in the omniscient, all details present sense, in the essential, structurally accurate, perception-based sense of someone who understood what was happening and who they were dealing with, and where the dynamic was heading. The knowing was present throughout, was accurate throughout, was doing its honest work throughout, and eventually produced the only honest conclusion available to someone whose perception is reliable and whose self-respect finally aligned with the knowing. That alignment, the moment the knowing and the action came together, is the most important moment in the whole arc, not the dramatic departure. The specific, quiet, honest moment when you stopped holding the knowing at a distance from its implications and allowed it to produce the response it was always pointing toward. That moment was yours, was earned, Was the product of genuine perception operating honestly rather than being managed around its own conclusions? The avoidant thought you were clueless. You knew everything. And eventually you acted on what you knew. That is not a small thing. That is the full, honest, entirely accurate account of someone who saw clearly throughout, and finally completely allowed the clear seeing to be what it was. Worth trusting, worth honoring, worth carrying forward as the reliable, accurate, permanently available resource it has always been. Your perception was right, it always was. The knowing did not arrive fully formed. This is worth saying clearly, because the retrospective view of what you knew throughout the dynamic can produce a slightly distorted picture, one in which the clarity was always present at the level of explicit, articulable understanding rather than at the messier, more honest level of partial knowing that kept deepening over time. The actual experience of the knowing was more gradual than the retrospective summary suggests. There were early signals that registered before they were understood. There were moments of clear seeing, followed by moments of doubt, followed by the return of the clear seeing with slightly more specificity and slightly more force. There were periods when the hoping was louder than the knowing, and periods when the knowing broke through the hoping with uncomfortable clarity. There were the specific, honestly difficult moments of choosing to continue investing while the knowing was present, not in a naive, the knowing is not really their way, but in the specific eyes open, I can see what this is, and I am choosing it anyway way that costs more than the genuinely naive version. This gradual deepening of the knowing is the honest description of what actually happened. And it matters for understanding your own experience accurately rather than through the slightly cleaner retrospective version that can make the process seem more deliberate and more clear-sighted than it felt from inside it. The earliest knowing was pre-verbal, before you had words for what you were perceiving, before the pattern had accumulated enough instances to be clearly recognizable as a pattern, before the intellectual understanding of avoidant attachment was available as a framework. The body knew. The nervous system registered something. The specific below-conscious, automatic processing that the human perceptual system performs continuously was producing signals that the conscious mind had not yet translated into explicit understanding. These early signals, presented as a quality of unease rather than as a named perception, as the specific, slightly uncomfortable, difficult to attribute quality of something being off in ways that the surface presentation did not account for, as the felt sense of a gap between what was being communicated and what was actually present, as the particular quietly persistent quality of something that needed more attention than it was receiving. Most people in this position dismiss these early signals. The dismissal is understandable and almost universal. The early signals are deniable. They are not yet supported by enough accumulated evidence to constitute a clear pattern. They can be attributed to ordinary relationship adjustment, to the normal awkwardness of early connection, to the specific reasonable variability of getting to know someone whose interior is complex. The dismissal is the reasonable, hope-compatible, genuinely human response to signals that are present but not yet conclusive. You probably dismissed them too. Not permanently, but initially. In the specific generosity organized giving the benefit of the doubt way of someone who does not want to make premature negative assessments of something that also contains genuine warmth and genuine connection, and the specific, real, undeniable quality of something that matters. The dismissal was part of the process, not a failure of perception, a reasonable initial response to ambiguous early information. The perception was accurate, and the initial dismissal was also reasonable, and both things can be true simultaneously. The second phase of the knowing was the accumulation of pattern evidence, the specific, gradually increasing collection of instances that were individually deniable, but collectively constituted something that was becoming harder to read as coincidence or ordinary variability. The first withdrawal after the first moment of genuine depth, the specific timing of it, immediately following rather than randomly distributed across the experience. The return after the withdrawal, the return to warmth that confirmed the connection was real, while also confirming the specific structure of the cycle. The next withdrawal, at the next moment of genuine depth, with the same specific quality and the same specific timing. The pattern was building. Each instance was adding to the collection. And the collection, accumulating over time, was producing something that the conscious mind was beginning to engage with, even as the hoping was still working to provide alternative framings for what the accumulation was demonstrating. This phase is the most honest and the most costly of the knowing's development. Because it is the phase in which the knowing is clear enough to be uncomfortable but not yet clear enough, or the other conditions are not yet present, for it to translate into the action it was pointing toward. The liminal phase of knowing too much to be fully comfortable and not yet being in the place where the knowing produces its honest conclusion. Living in this phase for extended time is one of the specific serious costs of avoidant dynamics. It is the experience of sustained cognitive and emotional dissonance, of holding incompatible knowing simultaneously, the knowing that the connection is real, the knowing that the pattern is not coincidental, the knowing that the pattern is unlikely to change without specific, genuine, sustained work that is not currently being done. All of this alongside the love and the hope and the genuine investment in something that the unguarded moments kept demonstrating contained genuine depth. Holding all of that simultaneously for as long as it was held was demanding in a way that has not always been adequately acknowledged. It required the specific, ongoing, genuine emotional labor of someone who was doing the full honest accounting of the situation while also continuing to show up for it. That labor was real, it was significant, it was not adequately recognized by the dynamic it was being spent on. The third phase of the knowing was the arrival at full clarity. The specific, no longer deniable, pattern is now completely legible understanding of what was happening and what it meant and where it was pointing. This phase arrived differently for different aspects of the knowing. Some pieces arrived with a single definitive instance, one specific moment when the pattern ran with enough clarity and enough weight that the last deniability dissolved and the honest understanding was simply present and could not be managed back to uncertain. Other pieces arrived more gradually, through the accumulation of the second phase building to a level that finally exceeded the capacity of the hope and the generosity to provide alternative framings. But the full clarity arrived. At some point in the arc of the dynamic, you were in possession of the complete honest understanding, the gap between the presented version and the real version, the structure of the withdrawals as fear responses, the genuine feeling underneath the pattern, the imbalance of the dynamic and what it was running on, the trajectory of the pattern and where it was heading, the specific, honest, accurate accounting of what was happening between two people in a dynamic that one of them was working very hard to keep from being clearly seen. You had it all, the complete picture, with the specific, hard-won, experience-grounded accuracy of someone who had paid close attention for long enough that the full pattern was entirely legible. What the avoidant did not understand, could not understand from their position inside the comfortable configuration, was what it cost to hold that full clarity while continuing to show up with generosity and genuine investment in something you could see clearly. The cost of knowing and not yet acting on the knowing is specific and significant. It is not the cost of being deceived. You were not deceived in the fundamental sense. It is the cost of seeing clearly and choosing for as long as the choosing seemed like the right thing, to continue investing in something whose honest accounting was already visible to you. Every generous act performed with the full knowing in the background. Every patient response to a withdrawal that was understood as a withdrawal, every honest communication offered in the knowledge that it would likely be managed rather than heard, but offered anyway because the possibility of the genuine hearing was still alive, and because the love was still present, and because the giving out before the honest conclusion was honestly reached. Felt like a failure of the commitment to what was real. All of that generosity, all of that patience, all of that continued investment was performed in the presence of the full knowing. Was not the generosity of ignorance. Was the generosity of someone who saw exactly what was happening and chose, for specific and real and genuinely motivated reasons, to continue anyway. That is a more demanding and more costly form of generosity than the version that does not know what it is investing in. It is the specific, eyes open, full accountability form of continuing to love someone despite the honest understanding of the situation. And it deserves to be acknowledged as exactly that, rather than as the naivety that the avoidance functional assumption of your cluelessness was implying. The knowing also had a specific effect on your relationship with your own judgment that is worth addressing directly, because one of the mechanisms of avoidant dynamics is the gradual erosion of confidence in the knowing. The dynamic's consistent implicit message, that the honest read is too much, that the perception is inflated, that the response is disproportionate, deposits doubt in a specific way over time. The doubt is most effective at precisely the moments when the knowing is most uncomfortable to hold. When the honest accounting is pointing most clearly toward the conclusion that the comfortable configuration cannot sustain. When the pattern is most legible and the implications of the legibility are most costly to act on. In those moments, the doubt arrives with particular force. Maybe I am reading this wrong. Maybe the pattern is not what it looks like. Maybe the interpretation is the product of my own anxiety rather than an accurate perception of what is actually here. This doubt is not random. It is the product of a dynamic that has an interest in the honest perception not becoming the basis for honest action. The doubt serves the comfortable configuration. And so the comfortable configuration, through the various mechanisms of its operation, consistently produces the doubt at the moments when the knowing is most potentially threatening to the continuation of the comfortable configuration. You navigated this doubt, not always perfectly, not without the doubt being effective some of the time in delaying the honest action that the knowing was pointing toward, but ultimately, honestly, with the full clarity eventually present and informing the honest conclusion that the whole arc of the experience was moving toward. The navigation of the doubt, sustained over time, against the consistent operation of the mechanisms producing it, is another piece of the specific, significant, genuine work that the dynamic required of you and that the avoidance functional assumption of your cluelessness was not acknowledging. Here is what the honest accounting of the knowing means for the forward-facing part of your life. It means your perception is an asset, a genuine, practically valuable, experience-confirmed asset that is available in every subsequent context. The knowing that was present throughout the dynamic, accurate, persistent, repeatedly confirmed, is the evidence that the perceptual system is working correctly and reliably. Not infallibly, not without the ordinary human limitations of perception operating in conditions of genuine emotional involvement, but accurately and reliably enough to constitute a genuine resource. The trust in that perception, not the blind trust of someone who believes their every read is correct, but the honest, calibrated trust of someone whose perception has been tested against reality over an extended period and found to be accurate, is something worth carrying forward explicitly, worth bringing into every subsequent situation with the specific grounded confidence of someone who has earned the right to trust their own read. It means the generous investment that was made with full knowing was a demonstration of genuine character rather than evidence of naivety. The knowing was present and the investment was made anyway, from genuine love and genuine perception of something real beneath the surface. That combination, clear seeing and continued generosity, is not a weakness to be corrected. It is the specific quality of someone who takes love seriously enough to invest in it, even under honest understanding of its difficulty. What the experience of the full outcome teaches is not to see less clearly or to invest less genuinely. It is to align the action with the knowing more promptly, to reduce the gap between the clear seeing and the honest response to what is seen. Not from hardness, not from the defended ration the investment version of protecting yourself from the cost of clear seeing. From self-respect, from the honest acknowledgement that the knowing, when it is present and accurate and has accumulated sufficient evidence, deserves to be acted on rather than held alongside the hoping indefinitely. The alignment of the knowing and the action is the thing the experience was building toward and is what the ending represented, the moment when the gap between the clear seeing and the honest response finally closed. When the knowing finally produced the action it was always pointing toward. That alignment, once achieved, is not something you go back behind. The full clarity is present now. The honest accounting has been done. The knowing and the action are no longer separated by the gap that the dynamic was sustaining. What comes forward into the life you are building is the full integrated version, the clear seeing and the generous love and the honest action when the clear seeing requires it. All three together. Not the clear seeing without the generosity, not the generosity without the honest action. The full version. That is who you are now. The person who sees clearly and loves generously and acts honestly when the combination of seeing and loving requires it. That combination is genuinely rare, is the product of everything the experience required, is worth honoring as the specific, real, permanently yours quality that it is. You always knew, and now you know what to do with the knowing. That is the most important difference between who you were at the beginning of the dynamic and who you are now. Not the loss of the naivety that was never really naivety, the gain of the alignment between the clear seeing and the honest living of what the clear seeing reveals. Carry it forward. It is the best thing the experience produced.